Hey everybody, welcome back to the Level Up podcast. I'm your host, Ken Rose, co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel. OpsLevel is an internal developer portal that helps engineering teams quickly ship quality software. Our Level Up podcast explores challenges, best practices, and stories from some of the brightest engineering and DevOps leaders about what it takes to build great products, teams, and companies. Today's guest, Christian Oestreich, is the Vice President of Architecture at WEX, where he leads the company's architectural vision from Minneapolis. Christian started his career in the late 90s on a small team responsible for launching Best Buy's initial foray into e-commerce. And since then, he has amassed over 20 years of experience in the tech industry. He has held pivotal roles at Optum, focusing on DevSecOps and streaming data architectures, and at United Health Group, where he spearheaded a new microservice architecture and the associated patterns that come with that. He has expertise in CI/CD, big data, and open source technologies, and he is a strategic innovator who constantly is evaluating the technical landscape. So, Christian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So, I talked a little bit about your background, but maybe you can tell us. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and your role now as VP of Architecture at WEX.
Sure, yeah. So I started my journey in the late 90s, which was, kind of an interesting time in technology because I think, the things we take for granted today, we had to do all by hand back then. So I think I've been living the DevOps mantra since before that was even a concept, right? Because, I think everybody who kind of gets interested in technology has this really big propensity for hey, I build a thing. Why do I have to keep rebuilding these things? And why do I have to keep deploying these things? And so I started my career at Best Buy, and we did things the old way, right? A lot of the old ways of working on servers and deploying code. And so as I moved through the ecosystem, kind of just really gravitated towards just how do we automate? How do I make my life better? How do I make everybody else's life around me better and more automated? So, through the years, just kind of did more and more of the automation, more and more of enablement, DevX, etc. Landed here at WEX. It's been an amazing journey at WEX. We do a lot of really great things, and one of the challenges that we have here is specifically we run a lot of platforms. And so when we talk about the scalability of how we do DevOps, how we do automations, it is a different scale than even when I was working in a huge platform at United Health Group where we had all the same developers on the same pathways, all the same developers on the same technologies, on the same deploy build processes. So definitely a challenge, but it's been a fun journey for sure.
Cool. You talked about the words, you use these two words together, developer enablement, right? And that's an area of focus for you now. Can you kind of define what that means for you and some of the reasons, again, as to why you think it's so critical?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I'm a developer. I think a lot of us start our lives as developers. And so what I think about a lot is, how do we reduce those mundane and repetitive tasks, right? So we take away that, I think I've heard it said cognitive, load around what we're doing day to day, the manual tasks. So when we think of developer enablement, I'm thinking about how do I quantify, how do I measure, how do I make sure that we're producing quality software, but kind of do that in a very transparent and non-obstructive way so that we kind of don't have to think about how do we do this stuff, how do we measure this stuff, and then that's kind of an extension of, hey, why should I have to think about every single step along the pathway of development, of deployment, of what things I should build? I should just be free to think about kind of the specifics in the details and not have to worry about the infrastructure and the just kind of the boilerplate, as we call it, right? So think about taking away all that boilerplate of infrastructure, ecosystem, development, and just kind of abstract that away into just a super self-service automation capability for people.
That's amazing. Yeah. So really letting developers focus on kind of the business logic and the core parts of value that they can ship for the business, and letting all the other stuff just be provided to them through a platform.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the trade-offs with developer enablement is that sometimes it narrows the road, right? And I know that that's one of the feedback I hear a lot from people is that specifically when you're working on a single, we'll call it technology ecosystem, that's okay. That's super easy to sort of put the guardrails up and let people just run as fast as they can in one direction. One of the challenges that we have in today's world, especially in organizations that grow through acquisition, is that the consistency is lost. So where we look to find abstractions for developer enablement, it's a harder question because then it's what's the thing behind the thing that we can automate that still allows a disparate ecosystem of capabilities to kind of operate. So, I think the challenge that we face now is we want to be multi-cloud, we want to be multi-technology, we want to be polyglots. So how do you enable those kind of behaviors, but still have that guarded experience for people to like be able to be free to move, but sort of not to worry about like where to move, so.
I was going to kind of touch on this. Like you talked about growth through acquisition. Are there kind of some unique challenges that you think you face at a global financial company like WEX around developer enablement?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the biggest challenges is just generally the maturity level within everybody's organizations that we tend to bump into a lot. So, we have legacy technologies that are, very profitable, but, perhaps not on the most, modern tech stacks. We have some applications that have been homegrown and are completely modernized and completely, fast and can deploy all the time. So I think that's probably been a big challenge. And other organizations I was at, like United Health Group, I mean, that is the the biggest like acquisition growth company in American history. So like we certainly faced that, but because it was so big, we had we were able to focus on our specific areas of work because the platforms were so big, right? And so when you get to other companies that have grown through acquisition, sometimes the platforms are revenue giants, but they're not necessarily technology giants. So the amount of people that are working there, can be influential, but need to be pulled along. And there's a lot of teams that need to be pulled along to like a modernization journey. So, yeah, it's been a challenge for sure. That's some of the getting people like to think about like how to modernize their applications that are just working, right, or how to like automate away legacy systems. It's been kind of it's been a hard challenge for sure.
And so I'd love to kind of, pull on that thread a bit. Like, how do you start that journey, right? Like, how do you think about, what are the first steps? Is it just defining, like, here's the baseline and getting some metrics in place? Or, how do you think about beginning that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it starts, clear vision and objectives, right, for the team. So we talk about platform engineering capabilities. And so I think the most common word I hear today in the industry is like paved roads, right? So like we talk about paved roads. And so when we pave roads, like you can't really pave a road without a clear vision and an objective of where you're trying to head, right? So like you got to know what the end state should sort of feel like. Maybe not 100% defined, but certainly, in an agile world, you can kind of shift and move, but like you should definitely have a clear vision of an objective laid out ahead of you. I think regular communication and collaboration is super important. This is something that's been, for me and I think for others, it's been a challenge. Like, it's challenging to keep all stakeholders, especially in an organization that is, of many factions, sort of like well engaged, right, and well informed. I think it's a challenge that we face a lot. And then I think lastly, kind of you have to have governance and standards set forth, right? So this is kind of the guardrails on the paved road, as it were. And so I think, developer portals are a great example of like how we can measure and quantify all the work that's being done, and like running campaigns to like sort of meet objectives around like what we want you to achieve is like super important. We are a user of Ops Level, and we've been using that for sure. Prior to Ops Level at United Health Group, we did a lot of this work in a custom, a custom application that did a lot of the same things on a different scale, where we said we can control the ecosystem. So we have to have the standards and enforce them and the governance so that when we have major releases, major upgrades, security vulnerabilities, just understanding where people are, we can move everybody forward at the same time through, again, like internal campaigns or through some kind of like mechanism that allows us to see where the current ecosystem state is. And so again, applying that to the enterprise scale, it's great that there's like industry tools like Ops Level to kind of help stitch together a lot of these things, and certainly there's also a process component involved into like aligning your teams. Like it's not just technologies, it's what's the process you use? How do you build software? How do you deploy software? How do we get it to production? So that's definitely a challenge that, sometimes tools can help with, but sometimes tools just don't solve like the process problem. So, I think that's still kind of a big rock for us to kind of nail that one down a little bit. Is like, how do we identify and measure process improvement? And so again, there's lots of things you can help to use in this space, but putting those two things together is super important, like the technology and then the process, and kind of stitching those together for sure.
I was wondering, can you make concrete, you talked about like some of the compliance initiatives and paved roads, like You mentioned vulnerabilities. Are there other kind of specific areas that you think about in terms of, these are the important aspects that development teams should be following? Is it things around security, versioning, game days, load tests? Like what are some of the inputs that you think about in terms of that, maturity level that you want, the paved road to have?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent for, I'll just call it quality, right? And so I think we've seen a transition in the industry to quality engineering practices, and I'm a huge believer in like just quality drives efficiency, right? So understanding how to get the best quality out of your software, and that's not just like QA. I mean, that's also like how do developers change the way they think about they build their software. And one of the proponents that I've been an advocate for and spoken on is metric-driven development. So like we have to understand what we're trying to measure, and like what. So I'll give you one concrete example. When I was at an e-commerce company several years ago, we were kind of just delving into this whole concept of DevOps. It had kind of become a new thing, right? And I think we really got the product-driven experience in Agile and DevOps like spot on. That team was fantastic. And like one of the things that we did was that we really laid out what are the key metrics that we want to quantify for our software that means that we're delivering value, right? Like that we're delivering quality. And this was in the runtime space. And every deployment we did a kind of a canary deployment. And if any of those metrics would get out of phase, we would instantly roll back the deployment. And we had the people and the tools to really say, like, how do we scale and roll up these deployments and make sure that we're still measuring the right things? So, for example, if we were looking at credit application, like submissions, if that number were to move out of phase, like, problem, like shut it off. Like, and so it could be a software bug. It could have been a bad customer, flow. It could have been, it might not have been an actual bug. It could have just been like we did something to inadvertently cause the process to like not be good for people, and then they have to like bail out on the process. But looking at kind of like how those aspects bring value to you is like the quality metrics that we are looking at, the signals we're looking at are super critical, right? So and then when we look at the quality engineering practices just in general, it's around when we build software, what things can we do to engage with consistency, right? And so for us, it's always been, how do we do contract-driven development, right? So it's metric-driven development and contract-driven development, meaning let's have contracts first, right? So I think sometimes we call it like test-driven development, but I think that this is kind of an evolution of TDD, which is, everything we do, if we're doing microservices or eventing or whatever the case may be, if we have an agreed-upon contract, we can really put some quality testing practices in place, like one big technology that we were a big fan of is test containers, meaning that we want to stand up a functional ecosystem around our thing that we're under test, and it's real because we're actually standing up real databases, real document systems, real whatever, and then you can like mock the interactions, but it's assuming that we have the contracts, we can actually mock them in a meaningful way, because it's not a fake mock. It's like a mock on the real contract. So like we're actually doing like contract testing through that. So I think when you think about like how do I layer additional quality onto my software development process, that could be a huge boost for teams, right? But still get like that, the test pyramid not broken, right? So we've got the unit test, we got the integration test that sort of operate somewhere blended between functional integration, so we can get more of those because we're not having to reach out to external systems. We're doing it with Dockerized, local stacks that kind of help us make sure that we're not breaking our contract. So again, quality is like kind of one of the key focuses there for sure.
I really like that focus also, that it's as well, like you have control over the state, right? You give the example of like test containers so that you have repeatability in that build process. And again, that's just like another point of leverage, I feel, right? In terms of like letting developers move faster because they're not going to have to worry about flakiness that could occur because it's going to some external system. They're able to kind of like have really tight feedback cycles in terms of getting the information about like, is the code they're building correct or not?
100%. Yeah. And I mean, once you solve that problem and kind of roll it out through your microservices, like it makes the whole journey of building microservices so much more stable, because we interop through APIs, we interop through eventing, but like if we can ensure that we're not going to like, burn down the world because we're not really good stewards of doing like, schema management, and like one of the practices that we adopted was that even if we have a contract locally, if we write a functional test using test containers, all the code used to exercise the API couldn't be shared with the actual service, meaning that you would essentially duplicate all of your classes that you would be using to hydrate data, which decoupled the actual runtime code from the testing code, because if you share a library and you change the code, of course it's going to work, right? But your constituents or your the people that are calling you, the consumers of your data, they're not changing their SDK or their library. So, we try to put a good focus on how do we make sure that we really keep all of the contracts intact and that we're exercising them like really well through like a really good functional test pattern. That didn't mean that we had to stand up whole environments, but we could do it, during the build process, during the CD process. So.
I'd love to actually, you talked about now just, we didn't have to stand up entire environments, we could have something a little bit more localized. I kind of like to talk about the financial aspect of some of the work that we're talking about here with the developer enablement, because we talked about making things more, have higher quality, making development more stable, more predictable. That helps reduce risk and improve security. But from a kind of, when I think about it at a high level, developer enablement work and developer experience work is an investment. And, then you can ask, what's the return on that investment? So how do you think about that? How do you think about, if you had to justify to your CFO, why is this work worth doing? How do you, what mental model do you use for that?
Yeah, so this is a philosophical challenge, I think, in some ways as much as it is a real one. And so I think what we do a lot is we make assumption-based measurements around how we want to derive value, meaning that if we do this, I assume we'll be more, better, faster, cheaper, right? And so, and we're currently in this journey right now, which is it's super top of mind for me, which is we have to have measurable, quantifiable ROI, KPIs, et cetera, that are on our work stream so that we can actually derive value. And sometimes you don't know the chaos that you're causing until you cause it, right? So this is true of I think platform engineering. This is true of sometimes when you have DevOps teams that are focused on building core capabilities. And so what we really try to get to the heart of is what are our safe assumptions for efficiencies that we can gain through, tooling adoption? So let's just take, for example, all the rage today is AI coding assistants, right? So when we have an AI bot to help enable software developers, you can look at the published statistics by, let's just take Copilot and look at Microsoft. They publish some pretty aggressive statistics around what your developer efficiencies are going to be. And so do I really think we're going to get a 40% increase in developer productivity? Yes, if I'm building a Node.js server from scratch without having any knowledge, sure, you can show a 40% increase. But if I'm already familiar with the thing, if I'm already an expert in the space, maybe it helps me write some docs. So maybe I get a small lift. And so we try to take a conservative approach to our tooling to say, look, we do wall clock measurements a lot. And so a lot of the things that we build are, because we're, again, we're paving the roads, we're trying to do this paved road style building of tools. We will take just wall clock time and say, how long did it take me to request the thing? Right. So for example, if I want to provision a VPC in cloud, how long does that take? So we'll start the clock, and then we'll put the request in through the ticketing system, and then we'll wait, and then we'll do the wall clock. And then we say, okay, what do we think we could reduce that time, that lead time to request a landing zone in a cloud? And then we'll go through, write the automations, and we'll measure it and say, look, if I do this through GitOps and using an orchestrator management, and I want to deploy a cluster into that thing at the same time, how quickly can we do this through automations? And then we'll say, look, maybe this isn't an activity we'll do 1,000 times a year. It might be, once a month, but we just saved X amount of time. And so I think without doing the experimentation around knowing what you're going to get, it is just assumption-based measurement, right? So this is something that's very hard in our space, I think, to actually nail down. So, we have feelings. We have a lot of feelings about how stuff takes, how hard it is, how easy we're going to make other people's lives. But we have to be cognizant that sometimes the inefficiencies aren't just in the tools. They're not just in the tools that we are using. It could be in the process. And again, measuring process is a lot of times it's just wall clock. It's just time. It's just time I spent wasted. So I think that's definitely a big focus for us, is looking at how do we remove our assumption-based measurements and start using actual quantifiable metrics that we can measure on the wall, measure in actual dollars, because essentially time is money, right?
That's a really good framing for it, because you're right that like a lot of times you don't know what the output is going to be, but you have like a range that you think, like you have some conviction that this work will be helpful, and it might even be hard to measure like how much faster. You can measure wall clock time, but it might be difficult, I think, across your organization to measure that coherently. But you can still point to we are, lagging indicators like we are now deploying software more quickly, or we have had fewer incidents in production as a result of standardizing or having automation in a particular area.
Yeah, and I think the hardest thing to measure is the thing that didn't happen. And when we talk about quality and defects and security, when we implement a tool, let's just say we want to have a container scanner tool inside of all of our pipelines, it's a lot of OpEx work for people just to like go add this layered scanner thing that wasn't there before. And, I get asked a lot of times of like, why are we doing this? It's going to cost like, X millions of dollars of like just time across thousands of applications to do this. And you're like, yeah, but think of what one security incident that we didn't catch because we're on some super old version of Linux that has some like 0-day exploit. Like what's that going to cost? And then like, so that's an easy one to have a thought exercise around. But again, it's assumption-based measurement, because it's like you're assuming that you might get hacked or you might get, some kind of like network penetration. But until it happens, you have no idea. So, those are definitely the super hard ones to quantify that we struggle with, because as we raise the quality bar, we're doing a lot of precursory scans. We're moving a lot of those activities to early in the life cycle of the SDLC to save time in production, which again, is sort of like the cost avoidance paradigm, which is, again, I like to think that that's going to save. We always say like it'll save us one incident worth $1 million, then it's probably worth doing, right? So,
right.
Especially being in like the payments space, and we also work in the health space. We definitely don't want to have any kind of like vulnerabilities or security issues in either of those two spaces for sure.
Definitely. When I heard a quote once that this was about businesses, but I think it's true for initiatives as well. They either should help you make money, save money, or reduce risk. You can kind of put any business in one of those categories. So making money, okay, that's easy to measure. Saving money is also easy to measure. But the reducing risk, it's like insurance. That's the squishier one, right? And to your point about like assumption-based metrics, it's if it happens, it'd be really bad. So how much is the investment worth? And is that investment worth it, basically, right? Is it an amount that we want to pay as an organization to not have to pay a much, higher fee in terms of having an incident and reduce trust of our users or security breach or financial penalties or anything that comes from that.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of compliance issues that when you're in certain industries, there's a lot of compliance things you have to like make sure that you're conforming to, and like again, reducing that risk is a huge benefit to the organization, especially when you automate away the risk reduction, right? So like, can I do things that mitigate the risk non-intrusively for people? Like that's like the biggest win. Sometimes they're intrusive because I have to spend some developer cycles, some tech debt time to like implement or adopt, and so yeah, for sure. I mean, that's spot on for sure. Yeah.
It sounds also like that point you made about automation goes back again to developer enablement. It's this idea of make it easy for developers to get started.
Yeah. Right. So again, when we want to build things, if we're really building widgets, which maybe you guys do. I mean, to run your platform, maybe you guys build widgets. We don't build widgets. Like we build all kinds of like pets, right? So when we have pets, sometimes it's hard to, automate the baseline, right? So like raise the baseline so that all those things are just done right out of the gate. But when you have inconsistent build processes, you have inconsistent cloud deployment processes, you have inconsistent runtime, it's really hard to like build those like watermarks into enterprise space. So I kind of sometimes envy those that are in a single problem domain, because you can really say like, no, we build Golang microservices, we have a Golang template and thou shalt use it. And it already comes with the pipelines and the quality gates and the containerized blah. And so all you're doing is just saying like, cool, hello world. And there you go. And like, that's, you don't think about that kind of cognitive load on like what it means to have to do all of the, mundane things that just make things, that do reduce that risk, that do reduce those potential problems later.
I want to ask kind of a similar question back to the financial part, right? We talked about kind of assumption-based metrics for developer enablement. As you think about kind of software architecture, are there any sort of financial implications that you think about coming out of that? Like at United Health Group, you led a pretty big transformation to adopting microservices. Was kind of like the bottom line and input into any of that? And if so, how?
Yeah, okay, for sure. So when we did two big initiatives that were really, I'll call bottom line driven, which was the move to microservices was like definitely something that we were on the journey from the start of the claims platform that we were building. However, it was everybody just spun up their own microservice, and that was sort of, it was the first step. And so I would say the big thing that I brought to the process was how do we now, again, raise that level and do templatized, easy to deploy, easy to do capabilities where it's, listen, I click a button, I get a GitHub repo, a Docker, a base Docker file, I get, the build pipelines, I get, I get the base code, I get all the REST API security patterns, authorizations, JOT tokens, like everything is just baked into there and you get a repo, right? And then from there, I just implement my logic and away we go. So the amount of time that we save from having to think about which libraries do I use and how do I do tokens and how do I inject, nope, that was all solved. And we had a really, really great architecture team that served as the DevOps arm, which said, yep, and we're going to take all of the build infrastructure and it's completely automated. All the things are injected. Everything's good to go. So literally as soon as you committed code, it just built and the container was there. And to deploy, you just had to say, hey, deploy manager, go deploy. And so reducing the complexity of the process was a huge financial boost because then we were able to scale out to thousands of microservices, right? So, each environment had hundreds of microservices. We had 13 or more environments because we had lots of different partner integration testing environments. So to be able to support thousands and thousands of microservices deployed constantly all the time, worked on by many, many hundred, tens of teams, at that scale, having to take away those initial steps was hugely beneficial because we when we wanted to build a new thing, we didn't bake it into the core systems. We just built a new microservice to do it, right? So, and then a lot of our communication was done that way. And then the second thing that we did that was a huge financial bottom line thing was we really made a shift in the organization several years ago to move to eventing, right? So we talk about what is eventing? What is, and we went all in on Kafka. And so one of the pieces that we really realized early on with Kafka was that a lot of the problems we faced from a speed perspective had to do with super complicated relational queries in our database. So we had a multi-terabyte database and doing these queries across these super normalized tables was very expensive, right?
Join hell, basically.
Join hell, yeah. 15, 20 table join that had to iterate hundreds of millions of records. I mean, sometimes billions of records. So we saw a huge penalty when people did certain activities. So what we said is hey, how can we make the site, how can we make the experience faster so that the usability of our software is just better? And this spawned a lot of different things that we did. But what we said is hey, let's use K-streams and Kafka. And this stuff is, it wasn't new, but it was still kind of, 1.0, right? I mean, so we're still kind of in the 1.0 space. And we're saying, how can we pre-compose using stream composition these big data sets that we have essentially cached instances of these relational queries? And we said, oh, this is kind of interesting. So we went all in on the CDC pattern and started pre-composing these data sets. So when we wanted to pull them up in a read-only mode, in a pre-composed JSON blob out of a, with a really rich index out of a NoSQL store is milliseconds of response time. So we were able to reduce minutes of execution down to milliseconds of execution. And what that actually did was a lot of our batch processes would have to look up one value, what's your first name? Oh, it's Ken. Okay, I got to go look that up by running this minute-long query. Well, if we had those pre-composed assets, now all of the automations that we had were able to tap into that, into those cached layers. Essentially, we didn't have to, again, when we have a code base that is multi-millions of lines of code in the big monolith, and then we have thousands of microservices. I mean, how many times do you have to read Ken and pay a minute penalty before it becomes a huge burden on the system, right? So those two things I think were hugely beneficial for the organization. Just to and again, it was just, we kind of thought outside of the box a little bit around hey, data streaming is great, but where's our biggest lift going to come from? And I will say that we had to make some assumptions, right? So we made some assumption based measurements around we think we can speed this up, and we did the experimentation in one of our innovation sprints. Holy smokes! Like, we were just blown away by how fast these things became, and how much easier it was to pull these out. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of financial boost in just speed, just time, and like, again, now Ken was available in a millisecond without, from everywhere all the time. So yeah.
I can imagine also, in addition to like better kind of end user performance, it also like reduced incidents and timeouts and just operational thrash, because it's not like, oh wait, why is this particular query now like going over, or P95 is way higher? Was that also kind of some of the impact that you saw?
Oh yeah, for sure. And now, I want to make sure I say that, like, when you introduce these like asynchronous eventual consistency patterns used in eventing, there's additional things you have to now solve. There's additional problems that arise, and so we did find, however, that the benefit that we were able to derive out of those things far outweighed the problems that we had. And like, usually the problems we had were consumer lag, or things were like, hey, we haven't caught up yet, or the CDC processor for whatever reason got stuck, so we had to like kick it. But outside of those issues, like, it was I think a wildly successful endeavor into like a new technology stack for an enterprise of UHD size, for sure.
Nice. I want to ask, you wrote an ebook a little while ago, and it was titled, outlining 9 developer enablement practices. And when I looked at it, and I'm thinking about the 9 different tips, right? There were things about like baking ops tasks into project bootstrapping, automating platform compliance checks, making software visible to all, and a lot of the theme that we've talked about here today around developer enablement, I think buckets into like kind of 2 groups. And I'd love your take on this. It's like, one of them is just having good defaults available through automation for developers, and the other is providing visibility to everybody from that automation. Yeah. Is that a fair kind of a summary of like what we've talked about today?
100%. I mean, this is like my career, like in 9 steps, for sure. And so the ebook was tailored specifically around the work we were doing to like build that microservice architecture, and like how we like enable developers. And I would say the key takeaways are kind of the second thing that you mentioned, which is like, what are we actually doing if we're not measuring and like being like able to put a stamp on anything that we have, whether it's what version of the thing are you running, like where are you from compliance, like what is your overall quality, right? And so if I had any takeaway from that, which would the cliff notes would be, yes, build the metrics, report, and like improve. So like that continuous improvement cycle on DevOps just kind of summed up in measure, improve, right? So it's pretty much the boilerplate of that, but 100%. So one of the reasons that we've adopted a developer portal in our current work streams is that we 100% want to just know what is where and who owns it. Like, it's funny how these problems, when you're working on a team on a single platform, of course that John and Jane own this, and Ken owns that. Like, it's easy on a small team, but when you get to the enterprise scale and you have 2,500 developers working across an ecosystem of hundreds of runtimes, the tribal knowledge is like, again, and assumption-based metrics become real high, because like no one really knows what everybody else kind of where they live and where they are. So, having those like really measurable, tangible like information around like, hey, how does your organization look? Like, just take some of the industry tools like a Sonar Cube or something. Like, if you're running something like that, so where you can like visualize what is the whole enterprise grade, like what's your grade, right? You take a developer portal, and if you're reporting those metrics in, you can say, hey, we have we need to run a campaign because now we can see that our enterprise is a D. We don't want to be a D. We want to be an A, right? Or we want to be a platinum level enterprise. So you can start running some of those campaigns to say, look, we can now see where you are. Like, it takes away the ability for people, and I'm guilty too, to hide, right? Like, and so we sometimes hide behind the complexity of our systems, but at the end of the day, they're not that complex. I mean, like, it's easy to measure them when you have the right type of like mindset around OKRs and KPIs and like what you want to measure around these particular platforms. So for sure, 100%. We had a guest speaker come to our organization recently. I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Finster, who worked at Walmart and kind of pioneered the minimum CD website mantra. But the journey that they went through from being able to deploy like every 5 seconds to every like it's basically like it didn't matter what the deployment like interval was. It's just like we can deploy right now, Okay, cool. You want to deploy again? We can deploy right now. Like that takes a lot of effort and time to get your organization there. And you can only do it through understanding the metrics of the system. Because again, anything could be deployed, but if you don't know how to measure that the deployment was successful, who cares, right? I mean, so, the metrics, the measurement, the quantification, and then if you have a quality process coming inward to your build cycles, it's so much easier to deploy. It's just so much easier to go to production kind of because you've already pre-gated yourself, right? And so that's kind of the two pieces that I kind of represented in that ebook, which is like, what are the things you're measuring, and then how do you enforce, quantify, visualize those two things, right, and put those together. So yeah,
that's great. We talked a little bit about particular tools. Are there other tools that you can talk about? I know you talked about Ops Level as a developer portal and helping bring that visibility. You brought up SonarCube. Any other tools that you've used and have found helpful in terms of like surfacing that visibility?
Yeah. So prior to finding some of the best SaaS tools in the world, we certainly spend a lot of time building those capabilities, and I think that you'll see a lot of organizations that sort of build it. And I think the reality is that everybody has a unique problem space to really measure their quality, right? Because if we could all say we're on the same technology, or we're all same, like it becomes easier. But enterprises are complex, processes are complex, and so I think what you'll find is that even when we have best in breed SaaS tools and other tools, that we are still looking for ways to quantify and measure. We'll call it SDLC productivity, right? So like what is our overall overarching quality of the software, of the process, of the people, and like how do we when we say we have the best in breed, right? So we say, hey, let's just say our software FUBAR is the best in our organization, based on what? I think we assume because the team knows Terraform and they're automated and it's super, but if it's full of security vulnerabilities that you're not measuring, is that really best in breed? So like, it's a complex 360 picture that we have to weave together of like these assets. And again, that's why I really like being able to integrate tools into, like an ops level thing where we could say, hey, run a quality scan here, but then like report it back in. Run a code coverage scan over here and then report it back in. Run a custom action in GitHub to do a thing and like, quantify the whatever, right? Like measure, are you using the right ABC, right? And then report that back into a place. And so if that head is, just a quality gate in your build process, so be it, right? If it's some kind of a portal, so be it. But I think that those pieces are very important to like think outside of the box, because we think about unit tests and functional tests and like, we often kind of say, well, yeah, if you're using Java or C# or whatever, you can run these tests on there. But like, how do you exercise the process? Well, we just run the process. Well, okay, cool. Like the old meme of like, well, I deployed to production and I tested it, it didn't work. Oh yeah, of course, because sometimes processes are hard to quantify and test, right? So what we have to be able to do is like make sure everything around the processes are good, are high quality, and that we can like understand as we execute through a workflow that we're able to see, success metrics through that workflow for sure. Nice.
Well, Christian, before we wrap up, I always like to ask guests, what is your favorite music to listen to while you're working?
Yeah, I do have my Spotify up a lot, and it's funny enough, my Spotify is shared, so I get to listen to my kids' music a lot because they steal it, and then I have to like their streams turned on. So, but for me, I like to listen to like electronic music, and so I kind of like to have that like driving beat kind of going, and so I can kind of like get pumped up and like just get code, and I don't code a lot anymore, but like when I do, I like to have that like kind of driving beat going in the background. Otherwise, it's like kind of like we'll call it heavy rock, not quite metal, but like like your kind of your engaged rock or your kind of high level rock. Yeah.
Nice. I definitely empathize with kids' music showing up in your Spotify playlist. I think I've had Baby Shark appear every now and then, and it's just like, where did that come from? That's not supposed to be there.
So many rainy tacos coming into my stream.
Yeah.
For sure.
And Christian, what's the best way for people to follow you or your work on social media?
Yep, I'm off most of the socials, but LinkedIn for sure. I do have a blog that I haven't been super active on, but I do have some useful insight that I've published in the past up there. I used to be an ardent speaker in the world, so you can find some stuff on YouTube for sure that I give talks on, metric-driven development and, modernizing your stack. And so YouTube, LinkedIn, just Google my name.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we will be including all the links to those in the show description below. And yeah, it was great chatting with you today, Christian. We talked about developer enablement, specifically also in enterprise, metrics and how to define the impact of that developer enablement and making good assumptions about the impact. So Christian, really, again, super thankful to have you on the show and really appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Appreciate it, Ken. Thank you.
Yeah. To all of our listeners also, thank you again for listening and making it to the end of another episode. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to see on the show, send us an email at levelup@opslevel.com, and we'll see everyone next time, and happy building. Bye.